Welcome to this edition of The Warning. I'm thrilled to be joined by one of our old friends, Sasha Ingber, who you can find on Substack at Schmidt. She is an intelligence writer and journalist and reporter and an expert on these matters. And so always love having Sasha on, one of the best, and thrilled to have Ned Price on. You can find Ned at Ned Price on Substack. Ned is a former senior State Department official and an officer with Central Intelligence Agency. And so there is a lot to talk about, but I'm gonna start here. Riddle me this from an intelligence perspective. If Bibi Netanyahu came out and announced after the Israeli bombing that the Iranian program had been obliterated and that the centrifuges had been destroyed, why was it necessary for Donald Trump to bomb the mountain and the centrifuges to also announce that he, in fact, was the one who had obliterated the centrifuges before there was any battle damage assessments? And so as we sit here tonight, the U.S. Air Force, professional, expert, this incredible choreography of assets in the air, 125 planes, fighter aircraft, electronic warfare aircraft, stealth bombers, the B-2 Spirits taking off from Missouri, refueling on their way to complete the mission. They obliterate the mountain. It's estimated we have 20 of these GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator weapons in the U.S. arsenal. We used 12 of them. We blew the shit out of the mountain, but apparently the centrifuges inside the mountain, according to the intelligence estimates, are intact. And so this leaves us with the spectacle of Donald Trump, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, the Vice President, who have all echoed Donald Trump's rhetoric that it was obliterated, are now forced to deal with the realities being reported. And we see the responses ranging from the president's completely unhinged, profane meltdowns to the denialism of Marco Rubio, who's saying that the intelligence officers who made the assessment, and this assessment, of course, leaked out into the media, is that these are the deep state plotters. So that's where we entered the conversation tonight. Let me just ask a yes or no question. Has the Iranian nuclear program been obliterated as described by Donald Trump? Sasha?
Well, for me, it's not a yes or no, because the intelligence is still coming in. These are early days, and I want to tell you about some of the people that I've spoken to in recent days, provide you some context. But I think it's safe to say that there are other facilities that are overt, and there are some facilities that are covert. We could also discuss the intelligence that has been reported on the movement of uranium. So I think it's safe to say that there's still concern that the Iranians could produce a nuclear weapon. This doesn't mean that the world is safe tomorrow, in the next few months, in the next few years.
I guess, Steve, I would respond with the same artful dodge that Sasha used. I don't think I can give you a yes or no answer. In part because, look, obliterated is not a technical term. Donald Trump is embracing this term because it sounds strong. It's a macho term. He wants to sort of will it into existence. But completely obliterated is not something you're going to read in an intelligence assessment, whether it's from the DIA, CIA, or any one of the 17 departments and agencies that comprise our intelligence community. Was Iran's nuclear program degraded? Almost certainly. And I think there are going to be iterative intelligence products over the coming days, weeks, and probably years that describe in more detail exactly how degraded it is. But there's a lot we can unpack here about what they still have, what they might have moved, what that means in terms of the concern going forward, and frankly, what we have to do diplomatically going from here in order to make sure that whatever they have can't be reconstituted into something that is a threat to the United States.
What was the threat to the United States? As I understand it, Bibi Netanyahu said that the Iranians were now taking a step to weaponize their enriched uranium. And this was the casus belli for the Israelis to act. Is there any part of that I don't understand?
Steve, you're right. Netanyahu one night in a televised address announces Operation Rising Lion, which we know ended up being a 12-day operation. And he said that Iran was secretly planning to weaponize uranium. Now, his IDF chief of staff also came out and said that they had been planning this for years. This was years in the works. And what's notable about this is that back in March, the director of national intelligence here in the U.S., Tulsi Gabbard, told lawmakers that the U.S. intelligence community had said, quote, Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and the supreme leader hasn't authorized the nuclear weapons program since 2003 when it was suspended. So these are vastly different assessments about Iran's nuclear intentions. And there's also different estimates in the breakout time in how long Iran would need to develop a nuclear weapon. And there are different levels of tolerance between Israel, which views this as an existential threat, and the United States, which is further away and has obviously a much bigger arsenal. Now, former U.S. and Israeli intelligence officers that I spoke with, thinking, gosh, why do they have such different ideas here? They explained to me that Israel sees Iran as its number one priority. And we have seen just phenomenal, deep human penetration. Remember last year, the walkie-talkie and pager attacks, which killed members of Hezbollah, Syria, and Lebanon. At least 26 people have now been killed. People from the IRGC, there have been nuclear scientists, people who worked on the ballistic missile program, which was essentially a deterrent for Israel to try to degrade the nuclear weapons program in Iran. So clearly they have very, very good intelligence. Meanwhile, the CIA has a much larger mission. I'm sure Ned can speak to that specifically, but it is a different mandate. It doesn't mean that they don't have awareness, but that might have been part of it. I also spoke with the former commander of Central Command, retired General Frank McKenzie, who told me that he has seen that sensitive intelligence often has contradictory assessments. And I guess if you think back to the COVID origins, we look at what was said across the agencies, there's still no real consensus there. This is complicated stuff. But adding one more layer here, just today, the head of Mossad, David Barnea, he actually did a rare video where he came out and he thanked the CIA for the joint activity and operations. And he actually specifically thanked CIA Director John Ratcliffe, saying that he, quote, supported the Mossad and conveyed the correct decisions that ultimately made this decision possible, and said that they were going to continue to monitor the situation. Of course, I contacted the CIA. The CIA didn't want to comment. But what makes this all so interesting is the fact that both Trump and Netanyahu have, in the last few years, had some real problems and conflicts with their own intelligence communities. So as I was speaking with people, there were all of these different ideas. There was the idea that maybe Trump was doing this to avert a future threat, want to take out this program because before it gets really dangerous, or maybe it's because Israel is getting all of the glory. This is such a badass operation that's underway. Same thing with Netanyahu. This is a man who has political problems. He's here for his survival. Maybe he's doing it for that. Or maybe he has wanted to do this for 10, 20 years, and that's what's motivating him. The October 7th attack by Hamas created a window whereby he could go after all of his enemies, with Iran being number one.
Yeah, see, let me just add one thing to that. There has been so much made of the dynamic between Donald Trump and his director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard. And so much of that goes back to the testimony that she provided to Congress in March when she restated that Iran and the supreme leader had not made the decision to weaponize. And I think it's important, obviously, to understand the difference between enrichment and weaponization. Both are potential threats, but you have to put the two together if you want to build a nuclear weapon. But the important point, Steve, is this is not something that Tulsi Gabbard pulled out of thin air. This, as Sasha alluded to, has been the long-standing assessment of the U.S. intelligence community. In 2007, President George W. Bush himself directed that the intelligence community declassified what was then a national intelligence estimate that 4 years prior, Iran had halted its efforts to weaponize. And the sourcing behind this, it was later described as authoritative. And to Sasha's point, look, we have lots of intelligence priorities, but there is really no higher priority than something like Iran's plans, intentions, and capabilities when it comes to its potential nuclear ambitions. And despite years and years of collection and checking and rechecking and adding new data points and cross-referencing them, the intelligence community has stood by this assessment for nearly 20 years. That's why when Prime Minister Netanyahu came out just minutes after the start of Israel's operation a couple weeks ago, and cited what he said was Israel's quote unquote golden information, indicating that Iran was moving in the direction of weaponization and had made advancements. It struck people like me as probably incongruous with what our own intelligence community has had. And what raises alarm bells in my mind is the fact that, look, we have no closer intelligence partner than the Israeli government, the Mossad, their SIGINT unit, all of the elements that comprise their own intelligence community. And if the Israeli government had this quote unquote golden information that contradicted the long-standing assessment and belief of the U.S. intelligence community, you could bet that they would share it with their American counterparts, and that we would take a very close look at it. We would scrutinize it in great detail. And the fact that Tulsi Gabbard reiterated the same assessment when she testified before Congress, and then in comments that were little noticed, the U.S. intelligence community reiterated that assessment after the Israeli operation started, to me, it suggests that we don't find that information to be credible, that it didn't change our underlying assessment. That, yes, of course, we need to take a close look and a critical eye to what Iran is doing on the nuclear file. But the idea that they were on the very cusp of a nuclear weapon, that does not seem to have been a shared belief by the U.S. intelligence community.
Okay.
And yet it's interesting that Mossad today says, thank you for joining us in this operation, of course, because the commander-in-chief had given the CIA orders. I also want to add in that there is some interesting example that we can look back to. Back in 2018, Netanyahu stands up at the military headquarters in Tel Aviv, and he delivers a speech in English with visual aids, and he describes a mission that about 24 Mossad agents went on in southern Tehran. They infiltrated a secret warehouse. They walked out with thousands upon thousands of documents. And Netanyahu says that this shows that Iran has been secretly pursuing a nuclear weapons program, despite claiming that it is for peaceful means. And this is a significant moment because this is in Trump's first term. And after this speech, President Trump decides to pull out of the nuclear accord. So it's an example whereby Trump hears what Netanyahu has to say, and he goes with what Netanyahu says. There are other examples that we could give of of Trump standing next to Putin in Helsinki and siding with Putin on whether or not Russia interfered in the 2016 election. I don't think that's quite as relevant as what we're talking about right now. But it is really notable that the president chose to side with a foreign intelligence assessment as opposed to his own. One other point that historian of intelligence told me recently when asked about this particular topic, he brought up the fact that last year, a former CIA analyst had leaked intelligence on Israel's plans to strike Iran. And so there might have been some hesitation to share intelligence with the United States, with the CIA after that. And we now know from several officials, including a senior Defense Intelligence Agency official who I corresponded with today, that they are beginning an investigation with the FBI to find out who is involved in that leak. Axios also reporting that the White House is considering limiting the intelligence it shares with Congress, thinking that maybe the leak even came from there.
Well, and of course, that is not optional for the administration to rewrite the law that they're required to share what they're required to share under American law with Congress. But I want to go through this next piece very, very slowly, because I want to be very precise. So, what we've just spent a quarter hour talking about is setting up this next turn. Is the Iranians have a nuclear weapons program. The Iranians have long maintained it is for peaceful purposes. They are the world's leading state sponsor of terror. They are a dangerous regime. It is run by a theocratic dictatorship that is saturated in American blood. It is an evil regime. It is a despotic regime, and that regime has no credibility whatsoever. The intelligence services of the United States have not changed their estimate until Trump's bombing that the Iranians were taking that step, moving forward, enriching the uranium. Trump has bombed the reactor. Trump said the centrifuges in the mountain. And Trump came out and he said this entire program is obliterated. And it's taken about 24 hours for that to unwind, for the intelligence estimates and assessments to start leaking out, and said that did not happen. That is not an accurate statement. So let me ask this question. If the Iranian program was not destroyed, as Donald Trump says it was, and in fact, the American intelligence assessment was correct that the Iranians were not converting their enriched uranium to weaponized strengths to make into bombs, doesn't this bombing now, from an outcome perspective, have the exact opposite consequences of what was intended, in that it incentivizes the Iranians to go at warp speed to the weaponization of the uranium for the purposes of building 1 bomb, 2 bombs, 4 bombs, whatever they can get as quickly as they can get? Would that be an intelligence assessment that would make sense following the strike that missed the head of the snake, did not do what Trump said it claimed to do, while Pete Hegseth is saying deterrence has been reestablished? It doesn't appear to be the case.
Steve, not only could that be an intelligence assessment, if you believe the New York Times, and I do, that was the intelligence assessment. They reported last week on this conclusion, this continued conclusion that the Iranian leadership had not made the decision to weaponize. But one of the things that could change that calculus was an American strike on Fordo. And so, yes, the incentives that were not present before last Saturday may well be present now, according to our intelligence community. The big question, Steve, is what capabilities the Iranian government still has at its disposal. Did it move some of the quantities of highly enriched uranium before the U.S. and Israeli operation, certainly before the U.S. operation on Saturday? Does it still retain access to centrifuges that could allow it to further enrich uranium that is now at 60% to weapons grade 90%? Does it retain some of the capabilities that would allow it, if it decided to do so, to actually move in the direction of weaponization? The short answer is we don't know, and we probably won't know. But what's important actually is that very point, that we don't know. And why that's important is because prior to Saturday, prior to the start of the Israeli operation, people like me, who have served in government before and who have spent a lot of time focused on this very challenge, were making the point that, look, we need something that is verifiable and that is permanent. Verifiable in the sense that we need to be able to guarantee and to reassure ourselves that whatever Iran is doing, it's peaceful. They're not going beyond limits that have been imposed on it. And permanent in the sense that Iran, whether it's this year, next year, or 10 years from now, isn't able to develop or acquire a nuclear weapon. The outcome we got, unfortunately, is neither verifiable nor permanent. It's not verifiable because it was done at the barrel of a gun. Quite literally at under the weight of bombs, and that's important because this was not part of a diplomatic agreement to get international weapons inspectors in, to get American officials in who could take a look in these facilities and could actually come to our own conclusions. And we're instead having to rely on these intelligence assessments, that by their very nature are going to be somewhat uncertain and imperfect, regardless of just how pristine our intelligence collection may be. And it is certainly not permanent. Just as we've been discussing, the Iranians now may have more incentive than they did before last Thursday or before last Saturday, before the Israeli operation started 10 or so days ago, than they did before. And so the outcome we're faced with now, regardless of just how damaging it was, is in some ways a real challenge for us going forward, because we're going to be reliant on this imperfect information, and we're never going to have the granularity. And as long as there is not a diplomatic agreement that's reached, we're not going to know with our own eyes, ears, and sensors what exactly is going on and just how much of a concern it should be.
I will say that jumping in here to answer this question as well, I would also, though, add that what is permanent? Is anything permanent when it comes to diplomacy, politics, or life in general? I don't know if we can actually strive for that. I think it is important to note that these are early days. When I emailed with this Defense Intelligence Agency official, the person said, this is preliminary. This is low confidence. Feel free to cast doubt on that personally if you want, but there is more intelligence to gather here. The person said, quote, "We have still not been able to review the actual physical site themselves, which will give us the best indication. Information is still coming in. It's too early to know how much damage was actually caused." I turned to nuclear expert Jeffrey Lewis, who told me today that based on the satellite images, there probably is severe damage at Fordo, but he was not sure about the tunnels. And he also talked about these facilities that were not touched, ones that we know about, and maybe two or so that seem secret. I also talked to former Israeli military intelligence officials who told me that Iran's enriched uranium would be something that the Israelis very closely keep an eye on. And I spoke with General Yaakov Amador, who was a national security advisor for Netanyahu and still had his ear in the ground operation in Gaza. So I asked him about the movement of the enriched uranium and how the Israelis would be trying to monitor this now that we've seen these strikes. And what he said was, my assessment is that they knew about this movement because it's one of the most important questions that Mossad, their CIA equivalent, and Amman, their military intelligence agency, that they would ask themselves. It is highly unusual that Iran would say, yeah, there was a lot of damage here. It does lead one to think that they could be continuing to deceive if the Israelis are correct in that assessment. It is something that needs to be monitored over time. But one aspect of diplomacy that I think will be a challenge moving forward is that President Trump had said he would take 2 weeks to think about it. And then, of course, we saw these strikes. We saw these bunker buster bombs. And so what will the Iranians believe moving forward? Will they think that there are going to be more deception operation campaigns that are just meant to trick them while something else is actually underway? And so I think that also complicates things moving forward. We know that Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said that he thinks that Trump is open to negotiating as long as there is no intermediary. He wants direct negotiation. The Iranians are in an incredibly weak position right now, but are they going to be up for it? I'm looking forward to talking about retaliation, in that is a whole other conversation.
Well, and the other reality of this is because Trump has said what he has said, he has locked himself into a position that this program is destroyed, regardless of what the facts show. He cannot do a follow-on strike without refuting through that strike what he said he's already achieved and accomplished, which is the problem of trying to conduct military operations through the same paradigm and prism that you ran the apprentice boardroom, right? And so one of the things I want to get into, which you talked about, which is deception campaigns, and I mean this truly. And I am a institutionalist. I am not a conspiracy theorist. But let's go through the players here. And let me just say up front, when the country goes to war, right, when the president sends an army to war, he has to bring the country to war with the army. And you don't send a political faction to war. You don't send a political party. MAGA doesn't go to war. The United States goes to war. And so let's go through some of these players. Bibi Netanyahu, no credibility. Donald Trump, zero credibility. Marco Rubio, zero credibility. Pete Hegseth, zero credibility. J.D. Vance, zero credibility. So I can go through all of them. Tulsi Gabbard, zero credibility. And how is it, right, that you as a reporter ask questions of these people who have no credibility whatsoever? And the way I could test that is if I was at a briefing today and there was Carolyn Levitt up there or any of them, Hegseth, Rubio, Trump, whoever was standing all together, the question I would ask is, just let me to set a compass bearing here, who won the 2020 election? And since you can't answer that question, honestly, it's impossible for you to answer any question honestly, including these questions. And so you can look at the intelligence mistakes in Iraq. You can look at people who put their finger on the intelligence trying to get to an outcome. But there has never, in my memory, in my lifetime, ever been something that straddles the ephemeral zone of Dr. Strangeglove, of Veep, of a farce, all wrapped together as one. And so by definition, any administration official you ask is by record a liar, doesn't have credibility. So how do you proceed in thinking about this if you're one of the 1,000 people that are on with us tonight in a world truly where you can't trust anybody on this. There are some members of Congress, I think, that can be trusted, but I think the media, generally speaking, has covered this in an abhorrent fashion over the last 72 hours. The statements by government spokesperson range from ludicrous to Orwellian. How do we think about how to process all of this in a world where credibility is evaporated? And I think it's related, though not directly, also in a world where we have Marines deployed in Los Angeles and mass federal agents abducting people off of streets.
I guess that question is for me because you said reporter, and I really wish it were for Ned. So
I'm glad it's for you.
Thanks, Ned. This is a complicated question, and I am not sure that I buy the argument that this is a monolith. What I find fascinating is that the accusation of politicized intelligence occurs among Republicans and Democrats literally on the same issue. When the director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, removed 2 members of the National Intelligence Council because there was an assessment that undermined what President Trump used to invoke the Alien Enemies Act, thereby being able to deport migrants. I had an interesting conversation with the head of the House Intelligence Committee, and he said that was an example of members of the NIC politicizing intelligence, and that's why she got rid of them. And I replied, but there are critics who believe that she politicized the intelligence by getting rid of them. And I think that even today, what we saw play out was the president going after CNN, which broke the DIA assessment, the preliminary assessment, and then the New York Times, and going after them and saying that they were politicizing this. Gabbard echoing online that this was the propaganda from the left-wing media. And meanwhile, the undertone of the reporting is that this information needs to come out because the president and this administration aren't going to let the truth come to light. Where is reality in the midst of this? When you cover the intelligence community, there's that saying, this is a wilderness of mirrors. And in some ways, I do think that is where we are. There's just a lot of pieces that we can't put together, and we have to continue doing the work of asking the questions and trying to bring together a spectrum of different voices to confirm information. I mean, hearing from former intelligence officials about what the Israelis are doing, what the capabilities and sensibilities are of the CIA, provides some context for this information. So, I think that's the approach that I take in doing the work that I do. I will also say, though, that when it comes to where Iran is going in the wake of these strikes, it's worrying. I mean, the Department of Homeland Security just a few days ago issued a bulletin warning of potential violence, not just of people who support Iran, but people who are anti-Israel, people who are anti-Semitic. They warned about cyber attacks.
And we have a 22-year-old landscaper who's the head of the counterterrorism desk.
I also have reported on the fact that there has been a shift in the domestic intelligence apparatus, whereby the people who focus on counterterrorism have had to shift into the deportations. Some FBI agents going out on raids now. A lot of the counterterrorism cases piling up. Well, now that the risk has been heightened, those resources need to go back to those places to keep Americans safe.
I would add, a couple things here. Look, I think, Steve, there is not a perfect answer to your question, which is the right question. It is the world in which we're living every single day. We're hearing lies, big and small, from political appointees in this administration. I think to the extent there is an answer, one ingredient has to be deep, deep skepticism. From to everything we're hearing. And I think it is going to require our institutions meaning the Article 1 branch to really do their job, to do their oversight role, to do it well. Obviously, this administration is putting up obstacles in the form of failing to share information, failing to keep them fully and presently informed, even on intelligence issues and national security issues where that is even more essential today. But two, I think we have to look to journalists and we have to look to reporters. We have to look to the papers of record in this country to really be doing the digging, to be not stenographers, but investigators, and to make sure that the American people are getting the facts, even if they are not presented, and even when they are not presented on a silver platter. Look, this is not part of the challenge, but to me, the problem you illustrated, we had never seen, I think, a starker example than what we saw about a week ago today, last Thursday, when President Trump went out, and I think to the relief of lots of the country and much of the world, he said essentially, look, he said this through Caroline Leavitt, look, given the chance of diplomacy, I'm going to make my decision within the next 2 weeks. And I think a lot of people took a premature sigh of relief, thinking that, maybe we can resolve this diplomatically. Maybe we won't have to drop bombs and risk a broader conflagration and solve this in a way that, as I said before, is verifiable and permanent. We learned later that was entirely a ruse. Call it a ruse, call it a lie, call it a head fake. But to my mind, there has been few, if any, more egregious examples of misdirection on the part of a president. Look, I work for the CIA. I don't mind misdirecting our adversaries and our competitors and keeping our enemies on their toes. That's fine. That's good. But what the president did and what the White House did is essentially misdirected the American people, misdirected our Congress, misdirected the public, misdirected our allies and our partners, some of whom were engaged with the Iranians on this very issue of diplomacy, to try to maintain the ruse that this was a viable channel, this was a viable outcome, when in fact, we learned later through some of that intrepid reporting that it was less than 24 hours later that President Trump made the decision that he greenlit for the final time, less than 48 hours later, to drop bombs over these facilities in Iran. That really is so corrosive to the fabric of our democracy. It is so corrosive to our diplomacy and our diplomacy going forward, because to Sasha's point, countries are always going to look to us skeptically when we engage. Is this a ruse? Is this real? Is this just a fig leaf while they do something else behind our backs?
Well, this doesn't reset tomorrow morning, right? This is the president of the United States, is not a person whose word means anything. He cannot be trusted. He does not have credibility. He does not have credibility with our allies. He does not have credibility with our enemies. He does not have credibility. And his sycophants standing behind him in his service don't have credibility either. And every military theorist, from Clausewitz to Sun Tzu to John Boyd, has written and talked about the moral dimensions of warfare as a strategic necessity. And so he is a disastrous leader, unfit at every conceivable level as a war leader. So Donald Trump has the statutory authority to be able to drop a bomb, and he has the statutory authority, constitutional authority, to order the missile submarines to fire tonight and wipe out life on Earth. We gave him that power, the American people. That being said, he is a man who does not have the moral authority because of his dishonesty, because of the fact that he's divided the country and pitted the American people against one another. And you have ICE agents with masks on beating the parent of a United States Marine in Los Angeles. And the idea in this moment that this country would go to war in the Middle East again after the two failed wars of the 21st century under the command of Donald Trump is not just a ludicrous notion and a horrifying one, but an absurd one, right? At a profound level. If there was ever a moment in the history of this country where the American people should be on bended knee saying, "Holy shit, God Almighty, now is not the time for this country to be at war." This is that time because of the immorality and the dishonesty of the people in command of the national security apparatus that have no credibility whatsoever. And, just the amount of lying and representations that just have come undone publicly in the last 72 hours is astonishing. And nobody alive has ever seen anything like it. It's just amazing to witness. It's amazing to witness.
What I find notable is that we're hearing a lot around time, whether it comes to the Iranians, the Israelis, or the Americans. There's these announcements of, okay, we did the 12-day operation. It's finished now. The Netanyahu and Israeli officials are saying. We've heard from Trump and his administration that this was one activity. This is it. We are done. The war is finished now. The Iranians signaled the fact that they were going to strike a U.S. military base in Qatar. There were no injuries from that incident. And it's like, if we just say it out loud, we won't continue this. We're not going to escalate and stretch this on. Of course, the ceasefire is very fragile. But these are the words that are being used to try to create an effect that nothing more will happen. I think where Americans might be concerned tonight is whether there is truly victory and success from this or just the appearance of victory and success. And that's not something that we will know for a long time to come. The other point that I wanted to make was that the ways that Iranians retaliate, it doesn't just take place in the immediate. They are deliberate. They take their time. If we go back to Trump's first term when he ordered the assassination of Quds Force General Qasem Soleimani, years later, they were conducting assassination attempts in the United States, in New York, in the DC region. It was John Bolton, Trump's former national security advisor. It was former CIA director and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. It was the president himself. Retaliation doesn't have to come immediately, and it doesn't have to come in the form of missiles. It doesn't have to come in the form of cyber attacks. The Iranians are in a much weaker state now than we have seen in years. But if we learned anything from Hamas on October 7th, it's that when there's a will, there's a way. You cannot beat somebody into submission. If there is a group that wants to take action, it doesn't matter how many years, how secret they have to be in the work that they do. They will do it because they want to.
One point on what comes next. I think Sasha is right to be thinking about that. Look, in some ways, the easy part is behind us, and not to minimize the risks that our service members took and the skill that an operation like this required. But you know what? These plans have been on the shelf for some time. They've been rehearsed time and again, and it's very easy for President Trump to pull the lever of force. And all he has to do is give a go order. And because of the skill and precision of the U.S. military, his orders are executed and typically executed flawlessly. What comes next, though, is much more difficult in some ways, because what comes next has to be a diplomatic resolution to this. This is not resolved, Steve. The fact that these facilities have been attacked, whether they're totally obliterated or degraded or their capabilities are merely diminished, it doesn't really matter. What we know is that there has to be some enduring limits put on Iran once again, the same type of limits, by the way, that Donald Trump recklessly walked away from in 2018 when he abandoned the Iran deal that did permanently and verifiably prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. And I say it's the more difficult part because diplomacy is more art than science. And the team he has assembled to do this doesn't inspire a whole lot of confidence. The chief negotiator, his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, 6 months ago was a real estate attorney in Manhattan. Nothing against real estate attorneys, but to say his experience on these issues is extensive would not be accurate. And more to the point, his track record isn't all that impressive. He's 0 for 3 on the big negotiations. Certainly nothing that he's been able to achieve on Russia-Ukraine. Certainly very little, if anything, that he's been able to achieve on his own between Israel and Hamas, where this brutal war continues to be waged to the detriment of Palestinian civilians and the Israeli hostages that are still in the Gaza Strip. And certainly nothing that he was able to achieve with Iran. And we saw the exclamation point put on that by Donald Trump himself last Saturday, when because of the failure of diplomacy that Steve Witkoff and the team had engaged in, Donald Trump opted to go ahead and use force. So, look, I wish them the best in what comes next. We know it has to be a diplomatic resolution. I am skeptical that they can pull it off. They certainly haven't been able to achieve anything of the sort just yet.
I have one last question for you, Ned. Bit of a change of subject, but I was wondering and was thinking about asking you this all day today. I published some pictures earlier of secret police, Iranian secret police, Russian secret police, American secret police, and I don't know what else to call them. And I really couldn't tell them apart. They all look exactly the same. And so if you were in the CIA today, and what was happening in America was happening in France, and suddenly there were masked agents popping out of unmarked cars, dragging people off of the street here and there, how would you describe what it is that you were seeing in France if what you were seeing in the made-up question about France is what you're seeing in the United States? What would you say is happening in France?
Yeah, Steve, it would have to be a blunt assessment. It would have to be a pretty somber assessment. And I'm sure there are many intelligence services around the world that are doing this right now. And I would be eager to read what some of our closest allies are writing about their own assessment of what is happening in our streets. I think there's no other way to describe it, but in some ways, creeping authoritarianism. And if this were any other foreign country, our political analysts at places like the CIA and the State Department's Intelligence Bureau and elsewhere throughout the intelligence community would be pointing out these indicators of creeping authoritarianism, whether it's the data point you use, agents in the streets with their head covered, the lack of due process, the direct assault on freedom of speech, on freedom of expression, deportations without cause, sending people in some cases with status in this country to foreign gulags, the embrace of strongmen and autocrats and would-be autocrats. There is no other way to take a look at that picture, that mosaic, and to conclude that in this country, the things that we worry about and that we note when we have indicators of authoritarianism, of the failure of institutions, that it's happening right here in our streets. And, I think we need to be cognizant of them as Americans, even if we're not former intelligence officials, former analysts. It is our responsibility to register in our own mind that this is so antithetical to our American DNA, to our American spirit, to our American Constitution, both literally and figuratively, that we just need to reject it out of hand. And we can't wait 3.5 years until we have, knock wood, a normal president again. We have to be doing this work now. We have to be calling it out. Our lawmakers have to be using every tool they can to hold this administration accountable. And this administration needs to be hearing that the tactics to which they're resorting just won't be tolerated by the American people, who, people like me, never thought we would be seeing this in our own streets.
So I'm looking right now. I have the disrupted your internet signal is breaking up message. So at the 50-minute mark, I'm going to leave it there. Perfect way to end it for the night. Ned, Sasha, thank you so much. You can find Ned at Ned Price. You can find Sasha Ingber at Schmidt. I think one of the very best intelligence reporters out there. You can find her at the Spy Museum podcast, Just the Best. Ned Price, follow him on Substack. I enjoy reading him very much as well. This is an important issue, everybody. Pay attention to it. And remember this, over the last 20 years, a lot easier to start a war than it is to end a war. And trust nobody in this administration who's telling you things that are proved not to be so with either your own eyes or with the information the media is reporting soon after they say it. You have to pay attention. You have to use your judgment, use your common sense, use your head, think for yourselves. And with that, thank you for joining.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
I'm Steve Schmidt. This is The Warning. I invite you to join this community where I promise to be honest, blunt, and direct about what is happening in this country. America is in crisis. Follow and subscribe to this channel and on Substack. Thank you.